This video was made possible thanks to InVideo AI. More details coming up soon. Why is there no free trade agreement between the US and Europe? It's absurd. In theory, the two great international powers are still unable to trade freely. What's more, in recent years, we've even seen tariff wars between the two regions, first by Donald Trump, but then also by Joe Biden, who, while restricting Trump's tariffs, hindered other exports such as liquefied natural gas. And this is particularly worrying, because since the Ukraine war and China's more authoritarian turn, international alliances are once again the order of the day. The Asian giant, for example, is making progress in reaching trade agreements with African countries. And although it's true that these countries don't represent a major international power, all these deals make it clear that the future will be divided by two large trading blocs. More and more people are talking about the need to decentralize supply chains, and from a Western point of view, to stop depending on the Asian giant in important sectors, such as electric vehicles or solar panels. And I'm not just talking about the US, because Europe has recently launched its own major trade battle against Xi Jinping's regime. The situation is red hot, and that is precisely what explains the birth of new defensive alliances, such as the Quads, between the US, Australia, Japan, and India. And how can we forget the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, the IPEF, an alliance between the US and numerous Asian countries with the aim of diversifying China's supply chains. But what about Europe? Amazingly, the US and the European countries make up the world's largest trading bloc, with more than 800 million people and almost half of all global GDP. What's more, they have been close allies in NATO for 75 years and share the same concerns about anti-democratic powers such as Russia and China. They are also each other's main trading partners. To give you an idea, US trade with Europe represents 18.5% of its global trade, compared to 12% with China. But even so, the US signed a free trade agreement with Oman before it signed a free trade agreement with the EU. But to make matters worse, the EU has free trade agreements with more than 70 countries, but none of them with Uncle Sam. So how much money will be lost each year just due to that? Well, it's unimaginable. We ourselves suffer from the problem. Many of the products we advertise on this channel are European brands, and as they are European, it's not easy for them to operate in the USA. Therefore, the advertising we do, which is also what feeds the whole team and enables this channel, is very limited. And the same will happen with farmers, artisans, programmers. In general, trade barriers are a pain in the ass, and typically they exist between enemy countries. But between allies, what's the point? Why on earth don't the US and the EU have a free trade agreement? In this video, we will tell you all about it. But first, as someone who's been making YouTube videos for a few years now, I know there's a lot that happens behind the scenes to make it all possible. Recently though, we discovered a tool called InVideo AI. It's the world's most popular AI video creator, with over 10 million users in more than 150 countries. It's the only tool I've tried that truly puts you in control and works like your personal assistant. But instead of just telling you about it, let me show you with an example. Simply ask InVideo to create a 3-minute video for YouTube, like one on why can't Europe compete with the USA and China? A topic we discussed just a few days ago.
Trade policies also play a significant role. The USA has numerous trade deals that favor its
And if something doesn't convince you, you can always make detailed edits as needed. Just go to the edit command box and type in your request. For example, you can translate the video to Spanish and add subtitles. It's that easy.
Estados Unidos y China tienen poblaciones y extensiones de...
By clicking the link in the description, the pinned comment, or on the QR code on the screen, you can create up to 4 videos for free on InVideo. However, they will come with a watermark. For just $20 a month, you'll get full access. And if you use my code, you'll get twice the number of video generation credits in your first month. It's much more affordable than buying all the tools separately. Plus, it includes a vast library of royalty-free material. A huge thanks to InVideo AI for sponsoring this video. And now let's get back to today's content. The fact that a free trade agreement does not exist is because neither the United States nor Europe have ever been too keen on it. After the end of World War II, both regions signed international treaties such as Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were created, but none of these agreements mentioned free trade. The closest we came to something similar was with GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It laid the foundation for the new trade law and significantly lowered tariffs and trade barriers. But 80 years have passed since then, and it was far from being a free trade agreement as such. The question is, why have none of the countries made an effort to achieve this up until now? Well, if you like, let's start with the US perspective. If we're talking about the US and rejecting trade agreements, one name comes to mind: Donald Trump. Because yes, although there have never been major attempts to unite the economies of the two Atlantic powers, an agreement came very close just 10 years ago. Do you remember? The famous TTIP. It would have been the biggest trade agreement in history. To put it in perspective, this agreement would have increased US GDP per capita by 13.5%, and that of the European Union by 5%. As well as that, 180,000 jobs would have been created in Germany, 120,000 in France, and 2 million in the OECD as a whole. No wonder David Cameron said things like this.
We're talking about what could be the biggest bilateral trade deal in history, a deal that will have a greater impact than all the other trade deals on the table put together.
In the end, TTIP was never approved and passed into history. And who was one of the main culprits? Indeed, Donald Trump. Trump pulled the US out of TTIP, but not only that, he also pulled it out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. This was another macro free trade agreement, in this case with the Pacific Rim countries. For many analysts, this was Donald Trump's worst policy during his 4 years in the White House. And not only because it was a shot in the foot at the economic level, but also because renouncing trade with the Pacific weakened the US position of strength in regards to China. But as we've already seen, the lack of trade agreements between Europe and the US is not solely a Trump thing, but comes from very, very far back. What's more, Abraham Lincoln himself had two star proposals. On the one hand, the abolition of slavery, but on the other, to put prices through the roof. In fact, high tariffs have always been one of the star proposals of the Republican Party. Even Ronald Reagan himself, who today is remembered as an inveterate neoliberal, started a huge trade battle against Japan that nobody seems to remember. By the way, if you're interested in the history of Reagan, there's a video on the channel that we uploaded recently. Now, I'm sure many of you are thinking that, of course, Lincoln was advocating tariff policy to please the typical rural Republican Party voter, right? No, nothing could be further from the truth. To begin with, the south of the country, which in theory were the ones who would benefit from the tariffs, hated Lincoln for wanting to end slavery. But these people made their living mainly by exporting their crops to other countries, and they knew that if the US put a tariff on them, the other countries would respond in kind. You know, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So the agricultural world, unlike today, was opposed to tariffs. And who was defending them tooth and nail? Well, the workers in the northern industries. Why? Because they didn't want to expose themselves to competition from foreign factories. And so, one of Lincoln's star policies was the moral tariff, a tariff passed by his predecessor that continued by Lincoln that taxed foreign goods at an extra 20 to 40%. But more importantly, this law served as the basis for many more protectionist laws during the 19th century. But wasn't the US the champion of trade? The reality is no. What happened is that after World War II, the country relaxed its protectionist policies. It became more open to the world and also actively sought to get other countries to open up. However, the White House got cold feet, and its desire to sign more treaties basically fizzled out. And do you know who was largely to blame? Latin American politicians. In 1998, the signing of the FTAA was proposed, a free trade zone that would include all the countries of the American continent with the exception of Cuba, from Canada to Argentina and Chile. It would have been the largest free trade zone in the world. So, what was the problem? Well, this agreement was frustrated by the red wave that flooded Latin American countries. Lula da Silva, Evo Morales, Nestor Kirchner, Hugo Chavez, Rafael Correa, leaders completely opposed to the spirit of trade.
Al carajo.
And of course, the humiliation of the deal not coming to fruition has made politicians very wary of such treaties, even with allies as reliable as Europe. What's more, conflicts with Europe have been constant. Do you want an example? Well, take the famous Banana War. Banana Wars sounds like a Bollywood parody of Planet of the Apes, but it was a commercial conflict that lasted almost 20 years. The fact is that Europe gave preferential treatment to bananas from Caribbean countries, committing itself to buy a fixed percentage of its imports from them. This was a kind of apology from Europe for the years of colonialism. And what was the role of the United States in all this? Although this percentage was very small, imports from the Caribbean accounted for only 7% of total banana imports. Latin American companies saw this preferential treatment as an attack on the new rules of the World Trade Organization. And of course, behind these Latin American companies were big American giants. What's more, the war escalated just 24 hours after Chiquita Brands, a banana company, made a $500,000 donation to the Democratic Clinton administration. In the end, the WTO courts ruled in favor of the US, but this conflict, which began in 1991, did not end until Europe applied tariff reductions to Latin American bananas in 2009. We're talking about a reduction of 60 euros per ton, which was made gradually and was not completed until 2017. Come on, this story gives a pretty good illustration of how the trade disputes are going. But notice one thing. In the banana wars, the US was in favor of lowering tariffs, while in this video we keep saying that the US is closed to trade with Europe. And no, there's no contradiction. The US, like any other country, is completely in favor of free trade, as long as it's only in the direction that favors their own country. I can sell you my products without any problem, but don't even think of competing with my local producers. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Joe Biden has approved one of the largest public spending plans in recent memory. We're talking about the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, which place great emphasis on developing green technologies such as windmills and electric vehicles. But combating climate change can wait, because the main priority of the program is not to decarbonize the economy at full speed, but to improve the local industrial sector. The vast majority of aid, as you might guess, only applies to local companies such as Ford or Tesla. And not surprisingly, European politicians are fuming and see this policy as a full frontal attack on free trade.
French President Emmanuel Macron confronted Senator Joe Manchin, the author of much of the law. "You're hurting my country," Macron said, according to people familiar with the exchange.
Of course, to be honest, neither France nor any European country is in a position to hold this against the United States, because so far, we've only seen one side of the coin, but the Europeans have their own version. In general, and despite the fact that there is no free trade, the tariffs imposed by Europe on the USA are generally very low. There are some more exceptional products, such as automobiles, the jewel in Europe's crown, which have a 10% tariff. And you will say, if there aren't so many tariffs, why not sign the agreement? The crucial point is that the real problem with free trade is not tariffs, but the even bigger problem that lies in regulations. Let me give you an example. Would there really be free trade if tariffs on ultra-processed food were eliminated? But Europe maintained its ban on GMO products, because about 90% of American products of this type carry some kind of transgenic that would be banned in Europe. So it doesn't matter if tariffs are eliminated, trade still would not flow. When they want to, Europe and the United States have sanitary controls that make no sense at all. For example, when a European travels to the USA, he or she has the opportunity to carry out an act that would be criminal in his or her own country of origin: eating an American chicken. That's right. It seems to Europe that American chickens do not meet the necessary phytosanitary criteria to be sold in the old continent, despite the fact that no European has problems eating them on American soil. And don't imagine that this is just a European thing either. When an American takes a vacation in Ibiza, he can also do something that would be a crime in his country: go to the beach with European sunscreen. So what's the conclusion? There's very little cooperation between US and European regulatory agencies. Every drug, for example, has to go through the strict supervision of the two regions almost from scratch. And of course, the bureaucracy is such a nightmare that there are products that become obsolete before they're ever approved. The US agency, for example, has been studying the issue of sunscreens since at least 2003. And as you can imagine, health regulations are just one of many obstacles. Think, for example, of environmental regulations. If there were free trade between the US and Europe, would American companies be able to frack on European soil? After all, US companies could argue that the fracking ban is a regulation that unfairly harms their business. In fact, this is exactly what they did with an environmental regulation in Canada, a country with which the United States does have a free trade agreement, and the courts ruled in favor of the Americans. It's this kind of thing that makes Europeans' hair stand on end, and that explains news items like this.
Tens of thousands protest in Europe against Atlantic free trade deals, critics saying the pacts would hand too much power to big multinationals at the expense of consumers and workers by establishing arbitration courts to settle disputes between companies and governments.
European politicians have said over and over again that a free trade agreement with the US would not lower health or environmental standards. But the TTIP negotiations were highly secretive, which made people even more nervous. Why? Because the European model was threatened by the ultra-capitalist American multinationals. I mean, the successful European model needs to be defended, right? But the implications could go far beyond what we've told you. For example, wouldn't free trade mean that US health insurance companies could operate in Europe, or that private companies could set up their own clinics and hospitals? Many people would see things like this as the first step in ending public healthcare and embracing the US model, where many say the poor die on the doorsteps of hospitals. Of course, this is not true. We have videos talking about it, but any smear campaign serves to attack the US. And what about the labor market? Americans are very productive and work many more hours than Europeans. A Swede, for example, works 70 days a year less than an American when you take into account shorter working days, more vacations, and more leave. Yes, that works out to 2 months and a bit. You did hear correctly. And of course, many people are afraid that if we lift the regulations, then Europe will not be able to compete with the US, and Europeans would lose their labor rights to allow them to compete. Is this reasonable? Well, actually, no. The problem is not tariffs. Europeans don't need a free trade agreement to be less competitive. In other words, Europe wouldn't lose competitiveness in any way, but fear sells more. And I wonder, what about the fear of being poorer? I don't know what you think, but the solution to poverty doesn't seem to lie in giving up trade, especially when Europe has been at death's door for almost 2 decades, while the US continues to grow. The point is that politicians don't give a damn about this. What matters to them is to get votes, and let's face it, horror stories sell, and they sell well. A free trade agreement benefits the majority of consumers, but it would be in the long term, and that is much less marketable in political marketing. Even so, all it takes is for the free trade to affect a small sector, such as the French meat sector, to create so much noise and generate so much fear that it scares away the potential benefits for people in general. Of course, these affected sectors are a minority, but they are very well organized and have much more incentive to lobby politically to avoid trade agreements. Now, does this mean that everything is lost? Despite all that we've said, we don't want this video to leave you with a bad taste in your mouth. Trade relations between the US and Europe are strained, yes, but they continue to move forward. One example is the TTC, an important agreement that seeks to deepen trade relations in technology products. What's more, although it was only a temporary policy that will expire next year, Biden has eliminated the tariffs Trump imposed on European iron and aluminium of 25% and 10% respectively. On the other hand, the World Trade Organization has a very interesting law, the Most Favored Nation Clause. According to this clause, a country must treat all other countries without a trade agreement in the same way, and in particular, must treat them as well as the country with which it has the most favorable agreement. What does this mean? Thanks to this clause, tariffs between the US and Europe should be kept low, 3.4% for US imports and 5.1% for European imports. On top of that, between dozens of small treaties, 60% of goods flow between these two countries without paying any taxes. In this way, the US can trade with Europe almost as if they did have a free trade agreement, but it keeps an ace up its sleeve if it needs to direct the policy of one of its partners. I'm sure you're familiar with news like this.
WTO concludes that the US maintained its tariffs on Spanish black olives. Industry sources believe that the US has set Brussels several conditions to leave tariffs behind for good, such as making trade talks with China conditional.
If you add to all this that, according to polls, trade and globalization is a priority for less than 1% of Americans, you will surely understand why US politicians are in no rush to sign a free trade agreement once and for all. But having come this far, it's your turn. Do you think you would benefit from a free trade agreement between the US and Europe? Which region is mainly responsible for the fact that such an agreement does not yet exist? Will we see one in the near future? You can leave your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we upload videos every week. If you like the video, please like and subscribe so that you don't miss the next one. Take care, and we'll see you soon.